The Nintendo Switch is about to ruin the entire landscape of the gaming industry. Nintendo just revealed the Nintendo Switch 2 and showed off Mario Kart World, Donkey Kong, Masahiro Sakurai's new Kirby Air Ride, and many upgrades to existing Switch 1 games. But not as all sunshine and rainbows. Amidst one of the most intense socioeconomic times in America is also the price increase of not only the console itself, but the rise in cost of first-party game. And what could this all mean for the rest of the gaming industry going forward? The Switch 2 is a leap in performance from the Switch 1. Back in 2017, the Switch released with a Tegra chip by Nvidia, which at the time was already considered to be quite weak in comparison to other mobile gaming industries, and couldn't even scratch the surface of performance against the PlayStation 4 and the Xbox One. Going into the new generation of consoles, with the release of the PlayStation 5 and the Xbox One X, and the rising popularity of PC gaming, it felt like Nintendo continued to struggle in terms of performance, but the stacked library of first-party titles and various Mario games and spin-offs, and the monumental and iconic success of Breath of the Wild, and the new entries into the franchise like Animal Crossing and Metroid, kept the console fresh. In 2022, the Switch faced its biggest competition yet, with the release of the Valve Steam Deck. And in the span of 2 years, every major gaming company wanted a slice of the portable market. And while Nintendo was already established in the market, it seemed like more and more Nintendo not announcing the Switch 2 was making them lose grip on the market. And Nintendo fans expected the Switch 2 to be a massive upgrade, considering Nintendo have had the gaming portable market on lockdown since the Game Boy. And after a legendary 7-year run on the Nintendo Switch, Nintendo unveiled the Switch 2. And Nvidia came in with a new custom Tegra chip that promises more performance at 4K 60fps and 1080p 120fps. And the reality is that the Nintendo Switch is merely attempting to catch up to the new generation of gaming hardware, where Xbox and PlayStation have had access to 4K in some capacity since the start of the previous generation. And in fact, for a handheld, this is excellent performance. But the controversies of the Nintendo Switch stem entirely from Nintendo as a company. First, let's talk about the price tag. The Nintendo Switch 2 price was projected to be at $400 in the US market, and while many discussions were had up to the reveal of the Switch 2 whether it would be affected by tariffs, most were optimistic for a consumer-friendly launch, like Nintendo typically aims for. To most people's surprise, the Switch 2 was revealed with a price tag of $450, which puts it very close to the range of the PS5 Digital and far away in comparison to the Xbox One S, and right there with the Steam Deck OLED. The problem is then exacerbated when you take into consideration that the Switch 2 had more than one pricing issue. Some of the games that were shown were returns from the Switch 1. Performance and visual upgrades were shown in all of these trailers, but players have to pay an additional $10 more in order to unlock new features and in many cases just quality of life upgrades. And while this is done by many other publishers such as Naughty Dog and The Last of Us, it still feels incredibly scummy for the people who have already had these games for years. Now to the biggest issue with that direct, and the piece that will drive the gaming industry further away from the everyday person: the new cost of game. While the new standard of gaming seems to be around the $70 mark, with examples like Call of Duty, Donkey Kong Bonanza, and the recently released Breath of the Wild, Mario Kart World was shown with the price tag of $80, which dissuaded many people for the overall price of the Switch. Granted, the Switch 1 on launch will have a bundle that includes Mario Kart 8 for $80 more, making the Switch 2 a $500 system. Mario Kart in and of itself doesn't do anything new either. The open world racing game has existed for years, with Need for Speed, Forza Horizon, and even all the way back when Burnout Paradise City came out. Banger game, by the way. While I don't doubt that the quality of Nintendo will deliver a stellar experience, is it really worth $80 for something that has existed for decades? Probably not. There are much more accessible games like Tokyo Extreme Racer that can provide you with that fulfillment. If anything, this is the perfect opportunity for a developer to find a way to swoop in to the $40 to $60 market to offer a kart racing alternative that is not only accessible in price, but as much fun. If you consider that the majority of the Nintendo audience are diehards and the average American family, you can bet that the diehard fans will buy the console day one. But how do you convince a struggling middle-class America today to shell out $80 on one game when you could easily buy an Xbox One S and download a plethora of free games like Fortnite, Valorant, and Marvel Rivals, and still easily have leftover money to buy your $10 carton of eggs? It just doesn't make sense to alienate the audience that Nintendo has seemingly always been able to reach. Amidst the continuing escalation of the trade wars between the US and its foreign allies, also proposes a massive tariff to ruin the accessibility of the Switch or any other console of that matter. The tariff of Japan and subsequently China will make the Nintendo Switch price escalate even further to those who may not be able to get their hands on the system on release. This also doesn't bode well for the gaming industry, as Nintendo is one of the biggest AAA developers, and them setting their games at $80 could give other publishers the false equivalence that their games are also worth that. And with scummy companies like Ubisoft and Activision, the price could go up to that point as the standard. The problems continue as Nintendo has a massive disdain for game preservation for collectors and enthusiasts, as the new cartridge on the Switch will only contain a license for the game that will be able to be downloaded via the eShop. This removes any chance of players being able to physically own their game or for preservation to exist. This likely comes from the massive issue Nintendo faced midway through the Switch's lifespan, where PCs and even Steam Decks were able to emulate the Nintendo Switch with Yuzu or Ryujinx. This is an incredibly anti-consumer move to their fans and collectors who have owned many of their games over the years, and even more so now for anyone who doesn't have internet access, unlike the majority of North Americans. Nintendo continues its own streak of being completely out of touch with the gaming sphere, as they've introduced their own chatting system that, while looks like a lot like Discord, isn't. You can voice chat, share your screen, and even use a webcam to show your face. The issue is that the screen sharing looks terrible, and the face sharing looks even worse. Nintendo even had the audacity to show its, at generous, 15 FPS game share on the Nintendo Switch Direct. And if that's the best that they can show it at, I'm sure the launch will be even worse. Not only that, but they have locked the chat behind a paywall, initially being free to people who buy the Switch 2 on release until March of next year, when it becomes a paid feature for Nintendo Online subscribers. So if you don't use that service to begin with, now your Switch 2 controller will have a whole button that serves no purpose, or in worst case scenario will prompt you to buy Nintendo Switch Online every time you press it. When you consider that Discord has been available on Xbox and PlayStation for a number of years, this move makes absolutely no sense. Nintendo's incredibly anti-consumer tactics, the continuing tariff war, the greedy new standards they're setting for prices, the out-of-touch voice chat, and the high asking price in an era of massive competitiveness in the gaming handheld space will make this one of the worst releases Nintendo has ever done.